The industry has changed significantly, as you all know, as a result of the advent of DVD technology. And an often overlooked byproduct of the DVD phenomenon lies in its ability to educate and inspire a whole new generation of filmmakers. And Richard Pepperman's new book, Film School: How to Watch DVDs and Learn Everything About Filmmaking, celebrates the power of the DVD medium to educate and enlighten, offering detailed analysis and revelations on 50 fantastic films. Mr. Pepperman's previous books include The Eye is Quicker, Film Editing, Making a Good Film Better, and Setting Up Your Scenes, The Inner Workings of Great Films. He is taught at the New School University, Pratt Institute, and he currently teaches at the School of Visual Arts, where he has been honored with a Distinguished Artist Teacher Award. It's a great pleasure to welcome Richard Pepperman to our program. Mr. Pepperman, hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. Hi.
And I didn't get scared away.
Thank you. See, Jamie, overreacted.
I know, I always do.
No.
Tell me a little bit about yourself first, and how you found yourself in the film industry, how you worked your way into it.
Well, it was quite a while ago now. It was actually February 1964. I spent about a year calling people, trying to see if somebody would be willing to take a chance on me, and I readily admitted I knew nothing. I had background in the arts and in theater. Was involved with an off-Broadway theater company in New York, and studied acting at various schools in the city, and finally reached somebody at the Film Center building who was one of the supervisors at a lab that no longer exists, Mecca Film Labs.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very kind. His name was Jack Haber. And I called him, and I called him back several times, not trusting when he said, just leave your number. If I hear of anything, I will call you. Mm-hmm. And at one point I called him, and he said, I told you to leave your number. I had a couple of things come up. And I said, oh, no. And so he invited me to come down to the Film Center building and introduced me to somebody. And I began by being trained to do track reading for animated shows on CBS and NBC. And it just kind of started from there. And then I got pretty quick at getting my week's work done, and so I'd hang out in the editing room to see if I could learn how to use the Moviola and other equipment.
Right.
And moved along from that.
So you worked mostly as an editor in the industry?
That's what I've done.
And I think you spoke earlier in your book about how you always taught the approach to filmmaking from an editor's point of view.
And most of the courses I've taught, I think, other than one, which was an elective class for non-film students, which was an introduction to film. Other than that, I've taught the art of editing and various levels of film editing.
Yeah. As an editor, I'm often curious about this because it's such a kind of invisible art. You know, if it draws attention to itself, it tends to be seen as kind of clumsy. Mm-hmm. When you watch movies, can you turn that off? That sense of trying to follow the skills of the editor, and can you
I do.
Back?
I do. Unless something catches my attention, and it can be one of any number of things, and if it catches my attention with enough interest or enough times during the screening, I'll often make a point of trying to get the DVD as soon as that's released. And one of the nice things, of course, now is that DVDs are released much more quickly after a film opens.
It's true.
And then I can spend some time looking to see what it was that caught my attention. And seldom does it have anything to do with a particularly bad cut. That is, an outgoing moment and an incoming moment. It has usually more to do with beat construction or structural problems that might catch my attention. And that's not to say that what I might disclose about it is the correct problem or even a solution, but just something that just gets me interested in what someone else's work has been about. It's also, I think, worth mentioning that Paul Hirsch, one of the really great American film editors, once was asked something similar, and he said he thinks that among the real great the great contributions editors make is convincing a director to delete something.
Right.
And so he said it's not so easy to sit and watch and try to guess what was deleted. And I guess it is, again, part of the invisible art notion of film editing.
Well, with some of your previous books and in your experience on film editing and tying it into DVDs, if you're to recommend 2 or 3 DVDs that represent a giant leap forward in terms of film editing, which titles would those be?
I suspect anybody who is interested in the advances in that field would likely want to see some of Eisenstein's films. I make use of Alexander Nevsky in film school. Of course, one of his most famous scenes is the Odessa step scene in the battleship Potemkin. People should look out for the DVDs that will display Dee Dee Allen's work, and she worked with Elia Kazan on a little-known film, which I got to see when it came to New York in, I think, 1961 or 2, called America, America. But, of course, Bonnie and Clyde, which changed lots of things. But also, just in talking to some other wonderfully talented film editors that I've gotten to meet, Evan Lotman, who is no longer alive, but a wonderfully kind and thoughtful guy. He and I chatted at one point about what intrigued us about editing, and he mentioned a film that was I found similarly intriguing and an inspiration to get into film, which is Tony Richardson's film, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. I guess people should see Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, The 400 Blows. In film school, what I've done to try to make viewing somewhat easier is I not only have the titles of the films that exist in each chapter, but then I have a cross-reference. So if somebody were to pick a couple of DVDs from Netflix or that they own, they can quickly look to see what chapters address scenes from those films.
Right. But have you seen the art of editing kind of changing over the years? And I'm thinking primarily because so many more movies are being made now to cater to shorter attention spans. And that's affected editing above all else, I would think.
Yeah, I think so. And I remember, early on when I was still being trained on 35 millimeter film footage, editors would frequently take a piece of film, hold it at arm's length, which was about 3 feet, and say, this is about short a cut as you could make, which is 2 seconds in 35 millimeter. Of course, that's all changed. People's eyes are much quicker than that. And I think for me, the biggest concern I have is that a lot of contemporary films try to have the editing itself, that is the process of joining together these pieces in this particular order, to have that influence the audience's engagement rather than the story. So I find, for example, that so many films resort, and I think resort is a fair term, resort to a parallel editing. That is, you don't stay on any one person or any one place too long, and you kind of cut back and forth, more like cross-cutting than even parallel editing. And it becomes, I guess, an easy solution, and it's almost a one-for-one construction. That is, you're on character A, then you go to B, then you go back to A, then you go back to B.
Sure.
In such a symmetrical fashion that I find it quite tedious, and it avoids trying to locate the real story you're trying to tell.
You know, I find that the cutting in movies now, it's so rapid fire that on the rare occasion when a director chooses to go for a lengthy, long take, it's jarring, and it's so much more powerful because you're not used to seeing it very often anymore.
Right. You know, you might get back to where violence is not so explicit, but only implied, and people will be startled by how effective it is.
Yeah, that's true. Do you find that DVDs are becoming more and more, are being used more and more in film school as an educational tool?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I hesitated for a very long time bringing in films when VHS format was available, only because somehow I felt that it might be, perhaps easier for me as a teacher, but not so effective a way of teaching. Rather, I felt that I should concentrate much more on the work the students were doing. But I've come to realize that wasn't really the case, and that the difference is that somebody with experience, with knowledge, hopefully with some talent and a broad perspective, can let students in on what they see, because I think so much of the discussions I know I've had with students may not amount to very much unless there's a reference that we can all plug into, so that if you run a scene and then discuss the structure, the beats,
right,
the physical action within the scene, the life of the character, the dialogue, the mood, the atmosphere, the light, etc., it allows for something that led me to construct this new book the way I did, which is the collaborative process of storytelling within film, rather than to break the book down into screenwriting, directing, editing, cinematography, that it focuses on the subjects that deal with the collaboration.
Yeah, and what are some of those subjects again? I know you go through examples of structure.
Right. Well, what I did was I separated the book into three segments. It is story, place, and character. And while particular disciplines are, of course, influence the segments, under story I have fragments, which then makes use of 5 films, which also deals with the history of film. And the history of film, of course, is very much reliant upon the history of notions of film editing. But I have fragments telling, structure, and contrasts, irony, dramatic irony, subplot, transitions, showing, atmosphere, and light is the first chapter in the segment place, which then includes setting, space, setups, and then character, which includes objects, dialogue, reactions, subtext, obstacles, performance, and that's it. Those are the topics.
Yeah, it's very thorough, and it breaks down about 50 DVD titles, and they're all essential titles. By minute and second marker. I mean, you really, it's really meticulous how you go through it, and very entertaining to read. I was interested too in the beginning of the book. You talk about an acclaimed cinematographer who was tired of being asked how he achieved his effects.
Right.
Because the real question, if you want to learn, is why, not how.
Right. Yeah, and that was somebody who taught. And I'll tell you who it is. It was Gordon Willis. And so if people want to Google Gordon Willis or IMDb Gordon Willis, he taught a master class at the school where I teach, at the School of Visual Arts, and did, as I mentioned, have included in his class people who signed up who were Academy Award nominees. Willis is extraordinary. And he became discouraged because it seemed to him people were much more interested in learning how he did something, that is, to have their work derived from his, rather than why he chose a particular approach. And it was discouraging enough that he decided that there really isn't a master class anymore.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, but it makes perfect sense because, just like you said, by asking how, that almost is asking, tell me the ingredients so I can imitate what you did.
Mm-hmm.
When why is the real driving force between the real knowledge behind the thing, because it speaks to the motivation and the artistry of what he does.
Sure, and what is unique within any context. One might list, as I did in this book, 20 some odd topics. But of course, once you throw in a particular context, you hope that the artist can realize that coming to the why decisions matters more than trying to replicate something you've done in the past. Because however common, I think, storytelling in cinema might be, there are literally dozens, if not infinite, possibilities to any particular context at any particular moment with whatever the variables are. And that's, I think, the most exciting part I have felt about film editing is, that you want to avoid getting yourself caught up in previous successes or a formula for an approach.
Right.
And pay very close attention to what might very well be the unique moment that you've not addressed before.
Yeah, and speaking of Gordon Willis, I mean, if a cinematographer's job is to tell a story with light and shadows, I think he pushed that to its limits with Godfather 2. I mean, that's extraordinary work right there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think he actually jokingly had been referred to as the Prince of Darkness.
Yeah.
There's a great, in fact, they show some moments from the Godfather, and you can see that the lab had a hell of a time pumping light in so that there's a translucent quality to the shadows and lots of grain. And I think he is interviewed about that moment and laughs about how he really screwed that up. So I think that's a great DVD for anyone to watch.
Oh yeah, it's just incredibly daring work, though. I want you to go through some of these films, a couple of titles, just to give people a sense of the lessons that can be gleaned from your book. They're all essential titles, and they give you a whole new appreciation for some of these moments in the films.
Yeah, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was especially taken by your analysis of some key moments in Lumet's film, The Verdict.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a character transition section that I believe when the lead character visits the hospital room, and what was the lesson to be learned from that particular scene?
Well, one of the interesting things to me about The Verdict is that just about the time Ed Dimitrich's book on film editing was released, David Mamet's book on directing film was released, and David Mamet had written the screenplay for The Verdict. It's an adaptation. Yeah. And on the last page of Dimitrich's book, he happily reports this one particular scene. It's a different scene than you're addressing, but I think it's worth mentioning this as well. Dimitrich thought that perhaps film had suddenly broken free from 20 or 30 years of a journey to imitate theater, and was returning to its roots of the European montage approach. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it interesting. In his last chapter, he talks about Eisenstein and other Russian theorists, and then mentions Sidney Lumet's film The Verdict. And in Mamet's book, he addresses his understanding of film as being nothing more than Eisenstein's notions of telling a story through a cut. Mm-hmm. But in The Verdict, there is a scene which I would suspect would have probably voiceover if done today, in which an attorney would reveal to the audience his sudden catharsis,
right,
and that he realizes that this case matters not only to the family but is his redemption. But in the film, this drunken, ambulance-chasing and worse attorney visits a rather run-down hospital where his client is on a respirator in a vegetative state. There's a beautiful use of both the respirator breathing apparatus along with a Polaroid camera he takes out. And his plan initially is he's going to take some horrifying pictures of this poor woman in a fetal position on a respirator, take it to the archdiocese office because all of this happened at a Catholic hospital in Boston. And then he'll convince them to give him a decent amount of money. He'll take a third. It'll never go to trial. He doesn't have to do any work and just goes on about his life. But in this scene, he takes out the Polaroid camera, and the respirator noise and the kind of the Polaroid camera's ejecting the print makes a very similar whooshing kind of sound. And he puts the pictures down. He takes two of them, and then he stares at his camera, of course, both as metaphor that he now sees something that he hadn't seen before, but it's not on a conscious level until you watch the scene some half dozen or more times. And then he just sits on an empty bed next to his client's bed and just stares. And Lumet actually has the two Polaroid pictures come to life and holds more than 30 seconds as the last developing part of that process in Polaroid stills comes about. Yeah. And we see his patient on this respirator. And we, of all things, we hear giggling. And it's two nurses on their way either back from lunch or on their way to a break. And one of them looks in and sees Paul Newman, who plays the attorney, Frank Galvin, sitting on the bed and says, "Sir, you're not to be in here." And he doesn't answer. And she walks towards him and says, "I said you're not to be in here." And there's this long 5, 6, 8-second pause. And he never even looks at the nurse. He just says, "I'm her attorney."
Yeah.
He doesn't use lawyer in the phrase. And we just get it. And this is a powerful transition within the story and the character.
And it's an example of just a beautiful piece of directing, where it's just a terrific filmmaker he is, where it's not on the nose. You know, it's a use of everything in your environment, the props, everything else. And you're right. It probably would include voiceover now, so that the audience would feel safe to know that this is exactly what's happening now. But the bravery of that it transmits the idea that his consciousness becomes clear as those Polaroids start to develop. Just that notion, it's beautiful filmmaking, and you're right. I did not necessarily appreciate the scene in that amount of depth before I read that description of that scene, but somehow I always knew it was there. But that was one of the revelations I found in your book. I'm wondering, before I let you go, what your in terms of the other extras on DVDs from commentaries and such, are there particular directors or scholars or titles that you're taken with?
Yeah, if I hear, let me just, I can go through quickly. I don't have all of it memorized here, but as I mentioned, and this is in alphabetical order, there's a filmography in the back of the book, and again, then it's in two forms in the contents. I begin with Alexander Nevsky in A, and then Amadeus, Atlantic City, which I would recommend especially to anyone interested in screenwriting. It's one of the great screenplays, I think, of the last 30, 40 years. A Ballad of a Soldier, which is a little known, at times kind of overly sentimental Russian film from the late 50s. Bonnie and Clyde, Born into Brothels, one of the documentaries I use here. Break a Morant, which is a film directed by Bruce Beresford.
That's a great movie.
Yep, and I think his work is well worth seeing. I think he's highly underrated, especially after leaving Australia.
Yes,
Breathless,
it is.
The Bridge on the River Kwai, Burnt by the Sun, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Casablanca, Catch-22, Central Station, which is a Brazilian film.
Is that Walter Selly?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good movie.
Yeah, and there's some terrifically presented scenes that I mention in the book. Colonel Radel, which is kind of a joint, I believe, Czech, Yugoslavian, Hungarian, German film directed by Istvan Szabo, who is better known, I think, for Mephisto, but it's the same group of actors that he worked with in that. The Day of the Jackal, the original version by Fred Zinnemann. Dr. Strangelove, Dog Day Afternoon by Lumet. 8½, Fellini. The Exorcist, The 400 Blows, The French Connection, The Godfather. High Noon. Hiroshima Mon Amour. I'm reading this from a list, by the way. I hope people don't think I am talented.
It's an amazing list.
You know, and as you're going through some of these titles, I'm thinking to myself, thank God for Criterion.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
I agree with Jamie. Yeah, thank God.
And here, and by the way, there's also a film. It was part of a two-part movie adventure. Jean Dufleuret was the first. The second was Man on the Spring.
Oh, those are wonderful movies.
Yeah, and Claude Berry, who directed this, I think too frequently produces and doesn't direct, and he's a great director. That's a Jean Dufleuret, I think, especially was successful. Judo from China, Zhang Yimou film. Kolya, The Lady Killers, the original one from Alexander McKendrick.
Oh, that's a funny movie.
Yeah, who also, by the way, has a book that's been compiled by a young man named Paul Cronin, who received McKendrick's notes from McKendrick's wife. McKendrick died quite a while ago, but he had collected over 20 years of teaching notes.
Right.
And Cronin put those notes together in a wonderful book by Alexander McKendrick, on filmmaking, introduction to the craft of the director. Yeah, Little Big Man, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, The Miracle Worker, Osama, which is a film well worth seeing.
That's a very interesting film. I think everyone should see that, and I think the title might have scared some people off, but it's very.
That's right.
There's a scene in there that's just worth it alone, but everyone should watch that.
Yeah, where the young girl is working at the shop where a man prepares milk, heated milk.
Yeah.
And the Taliban come down the street. Is the entire history of understanding cinema is right in that.
Yes, it is. You're absolutely right.
Plenty, Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, Rafifi by Jules Masson, Serpico, The Shop on Main Street, which is extraordinary work to see by Jan Kadar.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Steamroller and the Violin, which is a short I use here. It's an it's Andrei Tarkovsky's thesis film when he was at school in the Soviet Union.
Right. Well, you mentioned Plenty. That gets you brownie points to no end. That's an awesome film.
That's the Jessica Lange film from '85.
No, Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep.
I think that's one of her best performances.
Well, what was I mentioned it in the book because it was a little bit of a concern to me. I remember seeing it in the theater and was astonished by the bravery of the cinematographer in the opening scene. They keep it, but they actually have lightened it somewhat, I guess, because of contrast concerns when looking at a DVD on any kind of monitor.
Right.
But I mentioned in the book that it was much, much darker, probably at least a stop and a half darker. The Sweet Hereafter, Talk to Her, which is Almodovar film.
That's a good one.
Tom Jones, the Tony Richardson film. Yeah. Touch of Evil, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which I think is a film I've seen more times between the age of 12 and 15 than any other movie. The Verdict, The Virgin Spring, by Ingmar Bergman, Veridiana by Buñuel, Witness, and then Z, just so I have something from A to Z.
Even the Z is one of Z is one of those films I would tell anyone who's interested in making a political film. Mm-hmm. That's the one to start with.
Mm-hmm.